We're plugged in, mic'd up, and ready to roll with episode 14 of the Rooks and Becords podcast. I am Ted Asregadoo. John Young is here as well. Hiya, John.
Hello, Ted. How are you? Happy Thursday.
It's not only a happy Thursday, it's a happy birthday to John. We're recording this on April 22nd, which is Earth Day, but it's also kind of an Earth Day for John Young because that's the day you left Planet Mom and you became one of us inhabitants on planet Earth. So happy birthday, my friend.
Thank you, Ted. I appreciate it. It has been a great day, and you posted some very nice thoughts and kind words on social media, and I just wanted to say thank you. That was really sweet of you, and right back at you.
Thank you. Thank you. My birthday's coming up in a couple weeks, really, so we're only a couple weeks apart.
Oh, don't you worry. I've got that marked on my social calendar. The delivery should be showing up in the next week or so.
Good. So for those of us who listen to us, John and myself, on a regular basis, know that we've been focusing almost exclusively on music, and that's not an accident. John and I have been talking about our little podcast that could for a few weeks now, and the fact that we've evolved to the point that we're almost ready to flip the proverbial switch to a new name that better reflects what we do every week. And that's talking about music made by artists and bands that we absolutely adore. So in a few weeks, we'll be rebranding the Rooks and Becords podcast into Planet LP, where we'll be dropping the needle on a world of albums every week. I've been busy getting the new website built, and it'll take a bit of effort, but once we're ready to flip the switch, the only thing subscribers will notice is the name change on your podcast feed. So starting in a few weeks, we'll retire the Rooks and Becords name for a new amazing podcast, Planet LP. All the previous Rooks and Becords episodes will be available, so if you want to share them with folks, please do. John, would you like to add anything to our big announcement?
Yes, I would. It means I'm going to have to explain to my mother why Rooks and Becords is going away. It took long enough for me to explain what that meant to her in the first place. And now the rebranding, I think I can get her or convince her to continue to listen. It's just, once you got over that Rooks and Becords hump, it was clear sailing. Now there's going to be another change. Mom's not always comfortable with that. But listen, this isn't about my mother. It's about talking about what we love, and that's music and records.
Yeah. And so Planet LP will be orbiting that planet and beaming down periodically to explore what's on that strange new world.
Someone needs to look at the atmospheric conditions on Planet LP and just make sure they're safe.
That's right. Okay, we'll have Mr. Spock check that out with his little sensor thing. All right, lovely. Now, on with the show, and what a show we have in store for you, dear listener. It is 2 words, going solo. Yep, John and I are going to highlight our top 3 artists who went solo after quitting successful bands. I'd say we have an eclectic bunch here because we've already shared our lists with each other. We haven't shared them with you yet. We'll get started. And to quote Marty DeBurgi from the satirical rockumentary, "This is Spinal Tap. Let's boogie."
Wait a minute. Let me get on my USS Oral Sea hat so I can look into the camera with my hat on and get ready to rock here.
Going solo after being part of a successful or even mega group can be a risky move. What if your record sucks, right? What if your audience that you help build with your band just doesn't get what you're doing as a solo artist? Hello, Debbie Harry. Oh, who's at the door? Oh, it's Greg Allman and Cher. Hey, what's up, former Spice Girls? Is that you, Daryl Hall? Well, you get the idea. Not always when artists go solo do their records do well. But instead of dunking on failure, John and I are going to dish out praise for 3 solo records that we think are worthy of an entire podcast. So with that, I turn it over to John, the birthday boy, for his number 3.
That's right. Birthday Boy gets to go first here. Thank you, Ted. My 3rd album, we're going to go back to 1970 for this record. It's a George Harrison album. A lot of people think it's the first solo album he did in the post-Beatles era. It's called All Things Must Pass. A lot of people are familiar, but maybe a lot of people aren't. This record is actually George Harrison's 3rd solo album because he released 2 solo albums when he was still with the Beatles. And to say that he left the Beatles is also not quite correct because the Beatles broke up. And I get the feeling, based on the amount of material that George had to put this album together, if the Beatles had stayed together, he would have introduced these songs into the Beatles catalog, and he's actually quoted as saying that. So this record, All Things Must Pass, came out in November of 1970. The Beatles officially broke up, I think, in December of 1970, but they spent most of 1970 hating each other. They released Let It Be, their final album as a group, in January of that year. So this record comes out at the end of 1970. It's not only a huge smash hit, but it also uncovers something that people had suspected about George Harrison, the quiet Beatle, for years, which is this guy's got tremendous material. When he's allowed to put a few songs on a Beatles record, they typically are amazing. Songs like Taxman and Here Comes the Sun and Something. I mean, some of these just iconic Beatles songs were George Harrison compositions. Well, All Things Must Pass was a 3-record set.
Wow.
They put these everything but side, I think it's the second side of the third LP was kind of like a jam session, which wasn't necessarily amazing, but there are some amazing songs on this record. Songs like the title track, All Things Must Pass, My Sweet Lord, which everybody remembers and hears on classic rock all the time. What Is Life, the song Wah Wah, which is great. He teamed up with Bob Dylan, with Phil Collins, who played a lot of the drums on All Things Must Pass. Gary Wright.
Phil Collins was on that record?
Phil Collins is on the record playing percussion. Gary Wright is on that record playing the
Mr.
keyboard.
Dreamweaver.
The Dreamweaver is doing a lot of the keyboard work. And Bob Dylan is teaming up with George Harrison to write music on that record. Isn't it a pity? You'll also remember later on in the 80s when Bob Dylan and George Harrison were part of the Traveling Wilburys with Tom Petty and Roy Orbison and, the crew there. But this album stood out as really not only the introduction of George Harrison, the amazing songwriter, to people who already knew he was amazing but didn't realize he had all this material lying around, but it also pointed to the fact that Paul McCartney and John Lennon from George's former band, the Beatles, were literally holding him back. He had enough material to put essentially a 3-record set out really in his first solo venture without the Beatles together. And he just continued to move his solo career along with amazing records. But this was the record that established George not only as a talented songwriter, but as a songwriter who had been literally held back from putting his contributions into Beatles records on a regular basis.
No wonder he was so frustrated with the band towards the end. I mean, if he had this vault of music and they were saying no to it.
Right.
It's just like, come on, guys, these are good songs.
Well, and it was
not good enough for me, mate.
Well, right,
not good enough for me.
We're still running the band, George. Ultimately, this album, All Things Must Pass, is considered one of the best of the initial Beatles solo records. They all did a solo album when the Beatles broke up. Paul McCartney had McCartney. John Lennon, I believe, had Imagine, but it may have also been John Lennon, the Plastic Ono Band. I forget which was the first one that he released right when the Beatles broke up. But this one is considered the best of those initial batches of Beatles solo albums. So that's why it's included as my third and my top 3 solo albums going solo.
I like it. I do. And I learned that Phil Collins showed up on that record, not knowing that he was on there. I know he's a big Beatles fan. So
well, this was, of course, before he was in Genesis. I just recruited him to bang the tambourine a bit, and he did a great job.
Amazingly, he still had hair back then.
It's great. He still had a bit of a mullet. I'm really the one with the great hair, but it was nice to have him around,
Every time I'd comb my hair, he'd just be like picking hairs out of the brush to try to put them up on his head.
With that billboard of a forehead he had,
All right, my number 3 is The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill from 1998.
Nice.
Now, Hill is an interesting woman in popular music. She fronted the hugely successful group, the Fugees, who only made 2 albums, but The Score was one of them that I glommed onto when I was a grad student back in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania in the 90s. A fellow student of mine turned me on to the Fugees. She says, this new album's great. You got to get it. So I went out and I got it. And I did like it. I didn't love it. I mean, I didn't hear exactly what she was hearing. But 2 years later, Hill releases The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. And that thing just took off. The record runs the gamut of hip hop to soul. And it actually has kind of a concept attached to this album. The title comes from a couple of sources, but the most on the nose one was from a historian named Carter Woodson, whose 1930s book called The Miseducation of the Negro. Now, in that book, Woodson wrote about how the education system indoctrinates Black folks into accepting an inferior place in the world. And Woodson was a big advocate of being self-educated, an autodidact, I think is the term he used, as a way towards self-liberation. Now, Hill's album is a liberation from the hip hop scene in the 90s, wherein women were conditioned to accept inferior places in that world. And the rampant sort of misogyny and sexism in hip hop is pretty legendary. And it's very blatant in these, in what's called the golden era of hip hop in these albums of the 90s. She departs from that genre in a couple of significant ways. One was the lyrical content of the record, which touches on questions of like knowing yourself and being a mother, and always the ever popular topic too, love and relationships. And the second way she departed from hip hop was this, the production of the record. This was produced by Hill along with Shea Pope and Vada Nobles, but she's listed first. And I've read interviews with her about this record where she said she made a conscious decision to really work on the sound of this album. She wanted to go for a fuller sounding recording where the instruments could be heard with greater separations. She wanted to harken back to the soul records from the 60s and 70s, mostly the 70s, like a Stevie Wonder, how his production technique was so great. And she said that the problem with 90s hip hop was that many of the records really sounded like crap. Just too much emphasis on the boom, boom, boom bass or the tinny high end. And that was basically a production decision made that I think to make crappy speakers sound better. Because, they had the low end and the high end, but the mid-range was generally gone.
Right.
So if you listen to this album, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, with good speakers or with good headphones, you'll notice that it's very balanced, it's very warm sounding, and has a very full sound on it. Now, the standout track, of course, is the hit single Doo-Wop That Thing. I'm not a huge hip hop fan, so the songs that really make me want to turn it up are songs like Every Ghetto, Every City, that if you listen to that and you hear the keyboard work, you're like, it sounds like Stevie Wonder. And yes, it sounds like Stevie Wonder's Superstition on there. Everything is Everything, the title track I love. Can't Take My Eyes Off of You. Tell 'Em. Really, the latter half of the album is really what I loved. And it's really not a heavy lift to recommend this record. I mean, it's a stellar example of a great solo album from an artist who was part of a successful group. It won her like 4 or 5 Grammys. It was #1. And she never made another studio recording again. Not yet, at least.
Well, and that was going to be
was,
my question to you, Ted, and great breakdown of that record, of that amazing record, especially the production techniques that Lauryn Hill employed. I just was always curious about the story that followed, which is, the album wins all these Grammys. She's kind of touted as one of the next huge things in music, and not just as a performer, but as a writer and as a producer. And she sort of disappears from the scene. Do I have that right?
She took time off, and then she got caught up in failure to pay taxes. So she had to serve some jail time, not long, about 3 months. She got out actually 2 weeks before her 3rd month because of good behavior, but she was on the hook for close to $1 million in back taxes that she didn't pay. I think it was actually over $1 million. That was tough, but I think it kind of blew sort of her creative spark. But she's been recording songs here and there, like one-offs here and there, but she's never gone back to the studio to do a full album. Now that may change, maybe post-COVID, she may find inspiration, but gosh, if this was just a one and done solo album, what a solo.
That is a great point. It helps me transition as I dive into my #2 album here. We'll stay in the 90s with Dr. Dre's The Chronic, which is the album that he did after he left N.W.A. It left in a dispute too. I think they were signed to Ruthless Records, if I'm remembering this correctly. I was actually living in Long Beach at the time that this album came out. So I was very close, not necessarily in the musical community there, but I was a part of that wider community where hip hop and N.W.A. and other bands like them were very big at the time. And The Chronic comes out in December of 92. What is astonishing about this album, and I never had the album, I had the CD, which I bought new and still have, is this G-funk sound that came from this. And you were saying maybe you weren't necessarily a huge hip-hop fan.
Right.
If you listen to The Chronic as a non-hip hop fan, or as somebody who tends to like to hear a guitar mixed in or hear a beat that has a little more sort of backbeat quality, or almost that 70s soul you talked about with Lauryn Hill, a lot of the songs on The Chronic have that. Nothing But a G Thing, which was one of the big singles off that record. Let Me Ride, which is another song that just has this groove, this G-funk groove, they called it at the time. I think it's still considered G-funk, or Dr. Dre's considered the pioneer of G-funk West Coast hip hop music. I couldn't stop playing this CD. It was in my truck at the time, my 19, what was it again? was a 1993 Jeep Comanche pickup truck. There you go.
Okay.
Purple, of course, because I had to stand out like, like I needed to in Long Beach in 1992. But this record not only spoke to me musically, but it spoke to the hip hop community in a way that Dr. Dre sort of discovered some of the biggest talent that ultimately went on to become Snoop Dogg. And
Yeah, Snoop
I mean,
Dogg's
he's
on that record a
you know,
lot. Yeah.
if you listen to this record, it is chock full of other amazing artists that Dr. Dre was able to find. And once he started his own record label and brought people over to it, this is the beginning of that, of these sort of super group collaborations, and where collaborators with Dr. Dre went on to have their own amazing careers. Snoop Dogg is probably the best one. But I mean, Eminem was part of that group
Right.
of artists and performers. When you listen to the Chronic songs, and they're really like stories. I mean, they're pretty amazing. And they're, created around the time that the trial of those officers that beat Rodney King, and the aftermath and the LA riots and everything that happened in 1992, 91 and 92. You're listening to stories on this album, The Chronic. But if you're not dancing and grooving, you're not trying, because Dr. Dre took the storytelling and this very important narrative that's going on in South Central LA at the time and made it so accessible musically. And a lot of that had to do with this other talent that he found. I mean, no one's going to accuse Dr. Dre of being the greatest rapper ever, but he may have been one of the greatest producers and the greatest eye for talent at the time because of the collection of talent he put together. It's really on display with the album The Chronic. I can't recommend it enough. I still occasionally find myself grooving to it. And of course, as of today, 56-year-old guy, I feel silly sometimes getting as grooved into it as I do, but it's hard not to.
The thing about The Chronic to me is two things. Sonically, it does sound fantastic. Now,
Yes.
one of the things I think that Dr. Dre, and I don't know if he pioneered this because I don't listen to enough hip hop to know the sort of timeline of when these sort of elements came together, but it sounds like a movie. It's got sound effects, dialogue, and a lot of swearing. It's a very hard R-rated movie, that's for sure.
It absolutely is.
And one of my coworkers said years ago to me, we were talking about rock music, and I said, well, it's all dad rock now. It seems like it sometimes. He says it's true. He said, but you know what happened to rock and roll is it stopped being dangerous. And that's why kids glommed on to rap, because it was dangerous. Their parents were like, what is this? They're swearing. They're saying all sorts of horrible things. There's a lot. Are they simulating sex on there? What is
Yes,
that?
they are, Bobby.
What are the three things that hip hop artists from that era are generally rapping about? Sex and drugs and rock and roll.
Well, you make a great point, Ted. It's a dangerous record. It's a chronicle of what was going on in South Central LA, not just specifically in 1991 and 92, but he really focuses there. And if you read some of the press that came out at the time that this album was released, Dr. Dre said he already had storyboards in mind for these songs. He already had videos in his head already figured out. So just like you're talking about this sort of a cinematic feel to this record, I think Dr. Dre did that on purpose. That was certainly in the intent. That's why you can sit and listen to this record as much as you can put it on in the background and just have an awesome G-funk vibe.
Not a safe for work record, though. That's for sure.
No, it's not. I would not recommend that because there's going to be someone who will be offended by something. But ultimately, I think it is a terrific example of an amazing solo album after a pretty amazing career with N.W.A. Beginning in the mid-'80s. So that wraps up my assessment of one of the coolest solo albums ever by a person who had been a part of a major band. We're talking about Dr. Dre's The Chronic. Ted, tell me about your number two. No, your second album.
Well, that was fine this morning, but
yes,
I won't go there. That's
that's horrible. Okay.
That's beneath us. That's just right into the toilet. All right. So the number two is actually Bjork. It's her debut album from 1992 called Debut. She's been kind of a punchline for years or maybe even decades at this point. A lot of people don't know, maybe they do, that she was part of a group called the Sugarcubes. And the Sugarcubes released a few albums. The first one was the best. It was a fantastic record that came out, I believe, in 1988. She left the band and decided that she was going to do something different. She had brought some songs that ended up on this record to the Sugarcubes and they didn't like them. So okay, if you're not interested, then maybe I'm moving to London. I'm moving from Iceland to London and I'm just going to see what's going on in that scene. So she shows up in London, gets influenced by a number of musical styles that are in the club scene, and house music is one of them. House music is incredibly popular at this point, and she's going to clubs and she's kind of getting involved in this vibe. And she also meets some folks who later become influential in the trip hop band known as Massive Attack. For those who don't know anything about trip hop, Massive Attack's Blue Lines is probably the preeminent example of trip hop. Such a great album. There's some rapping a little bit, but it's very musical, very moody, very it has a vibe to it that feels very dark. So she gets sort of wrapped up into these sort of trends that are going on in London at the time. And she dusts off some songs that she actually wrote as a teenager and brings them to the producer Nellie Hooper. The two of them start working together on this record debut. If you listen to this record, whether it's a CD or a cassette or vinyl, however you listen to it or just stream it, the first song on the album is called Human Behavior, which lyrically is interesting because it's from the point of view of another animal or another being observing humans. And Björk said she wrote the song when she was in her teens and she dusted it off. The lyrics are kind of interesting. I'll read just a little bit from it. It says, if you ever get close to a human and human behavior, be ready to get confused. There's definitely no logic to human behavior, and there's no map, uncertain. So it's from the point of view of something, another being, if you will. And she said she actually wrote it from a child's point of view, observing adults, because adults tend to act one way and then sort of whipsaw into another way. From a kid's point of view, there's no logic to it sometimes, right?
Right.
Kind of confusing. Don't do as I say. Don't hit your sister and you get smacked upside the head, right?
Right.
Like, wait, what?
Well,
why do you hit me if I'm not supposed to hit my sister?
No, that's a very mature writing concept for a Icelandic teenager, I'm just going to say. And my exposure to Björk was literally through MTV Video. I didn't know much about the Sugarcubes, and I appreciate you kind of educating me along these lines. But I always felt like, as weird and trippy as she was doing deeper stuff than sort of like pop dance music, clearly.
There is pop dance music on here that if you listen to it, it's very house music. House music is dance music. I mean, it's played in clubs, for God's sake.
Sure.
So, of course, people want to dance to it. She was also friends with a guy named Talvin Singh. And Talvin Singh is a British musician and producer who had some success with, he fused this electronica dance sort of music with Asian Indian sounds. In 1998, he has a pretty good record. Well, actually, it's more than pretty good. It's a very good record, but he has the pretty good title of OK, which I think is more than okay. But she was friends with him, and Talvin Singh's influence kind of shows up in this record as well. So there's a very worldly vibe that gets expressed in song after song. Björk should get a lot of credit for the way in which she has influenced a lot of female singers post her popularity. I mean, she's still recording, but she's certainly not at her 80s and 90s height. She has this sort of inventive or this, I guess, characteristic way of singing that to me kind of, you hear it in a lot of popular music. Monsters and Men, that group, that's a good example. The popular song that's out now right now, and I'm blanking on the artist's name, but it's Driver's License. It's
Olivia Rodrigo.
Olivia Rodrigo. If you listen to the way she sometimes sings a little bit, there's a little Björk quality going on.
Good observation, TA.
The last bit on the chorus where she says, you said forever, but I'm driving alone down your street or something like that.
Yep.
Driving alone down your street, that sort of street.
I got my driver's license last week, just like we talked about.
Exactly. But the way she says drive down your street, it sounds like Björk to me sometimes when I hear it. Yeah, just a little bit. And I know that she's an American singer whose her ethnic background is Filipino, but I hear that drive down your street. It sounds like George. I drive down your street.
You do a pretty good Björk impression.
John, I am bringing you butterflies in a cake. If you open the cake, there's a butterflies.
I do it while I'm wearing a swan as an outfit. I put this one on so the bird head comes over my shoulder, looks like I'm wearing it and holding it at the same time.
See, and that's how Björk became a punchline because of all her sort of weird stuff that she showed up at an awards ceremony, draped in a dead bird. And
Well, how does
things
Lady
like that.
Gaga get away with a meat dress and isn't,
Yeah.
in the same sort of company as one?
Exactly. Have a listen to this record. If dance music's not your thing, you're going to hear a wide variety of styles. Of course, she's got dance music, but Human Behavior to me is a really great song because it's got that sort of rolling snare. What song has a rolling snare throughout the entire song? When we launch Planet LP, I think what I'll do, I'll create our own little Spotify playlist that will feature some of these records on. That way people can go and listen to it on Spotify, and then we don't get dinged for playing stuff.
Yeah.
Copyright
One thing we
violation.
don't need is more dinging. Okay.
No,
No one
we
needs to
don't.
get dinged anymore on this podcast.
All right. And with you, I turn it over. That's it for Bjork for me, but back to you, my friend, as they say.
Let me introduce my number one solo record. This one is maybe a surprise, but it shouldn't be. Don Henley, the drummer for the Eagles. His first solo record was called I Can't Stand Still. A lot of people scratching their heads at that, saying, I Can't Stand Still. I don't remember that record, because you remember the single Dirty Laundry from that record. Or you may, the other single that was released, a couple of them, one of them was called Johnny Can't Read. Why this album is so interesting and makes such a great discussion topic for this particular podcast is because the Eagles are undoubtedly considered, rightfully so, one of the greatest rock bands of all time. I'll go ahead and say it. Their songwriting, their playing, their musicianship, it was stellar. And when the Eagles broke up in 1980 after their record The Long Run, people expected the Eagles would venture off into solo projects and they would be amazing because they're the Eagles, right? I think people really anticipated that the guitar players, particularly Glenn Frey, Joe Walsh, who already had a solo career, perhaps Don Felder, would go on to do the amazing stuff because although Don Henley was a great singer and a great songwriter, he was a drummer. And drummers aren't always, unless you're Phil Collins or maybe Ringo Starr, considered a star in your own right to where people are going to run out and buy your solo records. Well, this album, if you listen to or read the critical acclaim at the time, Robert Palmer, not the performer, but I think he's a writer for the New York Times.
Yeah, the rock critic.
Yeah. He had said that this album, because of its grittiness, the album I Can't Stand Still, with this social commentary that doesn't really have an answer. It's just angry, angry at the news media with Dirty Laundry, angry at the education system with a song like Johnny Can't Read. There's no solutions. It's just anger. It's stripped down. It's more raw. The production isn't as flowery and gorgeous maybe as some of the Eagles album production is or was. Robert Palmer came out and said, I'll take this album over anything the Eagles have ever done if you want to highlight Don Henley's particular skill set, which is writing and amazing vocals. He's always been a great singer and can do falsetto and he can do growling kinds of vocal work, but he really demonstrates what an amazing piece of the Eagles puzzle he was on this record. And for critics at the time, they're like, The Long Run, hey, get out of town. I'll take I Can't Stand Still over some of the more flowery kind of almost throwaway Eagles stuff. The Long Run isn't a throwaway record, but it's not as good as, let's say, Hotel California or, Desperado or some of those other records from the 70s. Anyway, that's why I centered on this album, because it began a tradition of Don Henley sticking out as the solo Eagle who really had something to say. Glenn Frey didn't have a lot of hits as a solo artist. Don Felder didn't. Joe Walsh didn't necessarily. I mean, he was a better solo artist when he was with the Eagles than after they broke up. Walsh's career didn't really take off till the Eagles got back together again. And when they had their Hell Freezes Over tour in the mid 90s. So that's how I Can't Stand Still makes my number one. And by the way, it is not the best Don Henley solo record. I believe that came next. His next solo album, Building the Perfect Beast with Boys of Summer and All She Wants to Do Is Dance. I mean, for the drummer of the Eagles, this guy was writing some pretty compelling pop rock stuff.
He had a great run through the 80s and part of the 90s. Just the fact that each one of his solo albums did incredibly well. Even the Age of the Innocence, not Age of the Innocence, it was End of the Innocence.
The
That
End
was
of
it.
the Innocence, right. He released about 4 solo albums, so it wasn't as if he was one of these guys that was still cashing in. And then by the time, the Eagles reunited and then they broke up again and then they got back together for that record in 2003, this was the beginning. This album, I Can't Stand Still, was the beginning of people turning around and going, wait, Don Henley is the solo Eagle that's going to soar the highest? See what I did there?
I saw that.
Okay, just Asregadoo, this is easy to do back here. I mean, I'm coming up with content and I'm coming up with jokes and great way to close things out. That's not, don't try this at home.
You make a great point about Don Henley having a lot to say, more than his other bandmates did. And you never would have thought, I mean, granted, he did take the lead vocal on a lot of iconic Eagles songs, but yeah, you're right. He was the drummer. And oftentimes the drummers don't take the starring role, but he certainly had a lot of success through the 80s and 90s with his solo career. So he has nothing to be ashamed of there.
No, apparently he's a jerk, by the way, too. And I don't know this.
Is.
And if
I don't think
I think that podcast, I apologize. Yeah, apparently he can be a real ornery cuss. But listen, Don Henley, you keep rocking. I can't wait to find out what my friend Ted has decided is his #1 solo record.
Well, mine is Robbie Robertson's 1987 self-titled solo album.
You love this guy.
I love Robbie Robertson's solo work. I really do. You mentioned George Harrison's All Things Must Pass as an album that's basically got a who's who of musicians on that record. Well, so does this album. Now, for those who don't know, Robbie Robertson was a founding member of a group called The Band, who backed Bob Dylan initially when he switched from the sort of folky acoustic stuff to the plugged in rock and roll. So Robertson breaks up The Band on Thanksgiving 1976 in San Francisco after a performance at the Winterland Ballroom, which was documented in the film The Last Waltz. So he kind of lays low for not quite a decade. He did some soundtrack work for his friend Martin Scorsese, who also directed The Last Waltz. And then around 1984, he decides, I'm in Hollywood. People are saying I'm a good looking guy. I could become an actor, but I don't like any of the scripts that are coming my way. And I'm just not into the acting thing. And so he decided to get out of the movie biz and start writing again. So he started sketching ideas for a record. And by 1986, he teams up with then superstar producer Daniel Lanois. Daniel Lanois and Brian Eno were the pair who masterminded U2's Unforgettable Fire and the Joshua Tree, 2 fantastic albums by U2. Lanois was also the co-producer of Peter Gabriel's hugely successful album. So, about 2 years, Robbie Robertson, for some reason, was able to convince record labels to give him money to do pre-production on this record. I'm not sure what he did with the money. I don't think he blew it on cocaine and booze, but he wasn't making much progress on it until 1986 when he and Lanois just finished making the Joshua Tree, says, okay, finally, good. I'll come work with you on this project. But boy, what an album that they created. And I like the who's who. Listen to this lineup of people that helped Robbie Robertson make this record. Peter Gabriel shows up doing co-vocals. U2 backs him on 2 songs. Bono's actually singing co-vocals on 2 songs. The Bodines, 2 members of the Bodines are there. A couple of members from the band, Garth Hudson, Rick Danko show up. Maria McKee, who she was in a band called Lone Justice before she went solo. And a slew of well-known session players like Manu Katché, who was on drums, Terry Bozzio, who was with Missing Persons, but he was the drummer for Frank Zappa, Tony Levin on bass, and even jazz trumpeter Gil Evans shows up on this record. Now, a superstar lineup doesn't always make a good record, but from start to finish, these songs are solid, from Fallen Angel, which has co-vocals with Peter Gabriel, to Showdown at Big Sky, that has one member of the Bodines on there, Broken Arrow, Sweet Fire of Love, which is the one of 2 collaborations with U2. Somewhere Down the Crazy River is fantastic. Right to the End, Testimony. Fantastic record from start to finish. It cost well over $1 million to make this record, and he was on the Geffen label, and David Geffen was freaking out because he was all like, you just keep sucking money from me. When are you going to make this record? He goes, it's coming along. It'll be there soon. He says, we're almost $1 million in the hole for this record, but it made all its money back because it had some successful songs. They're very biographical. They tend to reference Robertson's ethnic background. He's part Native American. I just can't recommend this record enough. It's one of my favorites. I know a lot of people don't like Robbie Robertson because of his role in the band and how he broke up. That essential supergroup and how he treated some of the band members post breakup. Taking that aside, we talked about Don Henley being kind of a jerk. Robbie Robertson's probably kind of a jerk, but he made a good record here.
There's so many parallels to Robbie Robertson and John Fogerty from Creedence Clearwater Revival with regard to breaking up a supergroup and moving on and following your own muse and not necessarily treating your former bandmates great, but still making incredibly relevant music and amazing stuff. And now you've whetted my appetite to give him a little bit more money and download my own copy of this record, because having been a fan of the band and not the personalities in the band, I just like their music. I mean, who doesn't love Up on Cripple Creek and some of the great
Weight?
Yeah,
I mean,
come
the
on.
Weight itself is like a freaking hymn, man.
Oh my goodness.
So,
yeah. And that, if you haven't gone to see The Last Waltz, you need to revisit that. It's a great film. This is more why I love TA Analysis, because you get me thinking about, well, see, I remember some of those songs, but it's been so long since I revisited them. Now I need to go back and listen again and probably fall weirdly in love with Robbie Robertson, just like you.
And I'll probably listen to Don Henley. I don't like the Eagles very much. I know that's heresy to say, but
okay.
I know.
Right.
And a lot of it has to do with Don Henley's personality. I just don't like the guy.
Rubs you like sandpaper. I get it. And that's why it's so much easier to go listen to a song like Boys of Summer or All She Wants to Do Is Dance or The End of the Innocents. Pick any of those great tracks from his solo career. Just don't listen to him. Don't listen to him talk. Just listen to him perform. And that's the way to do it.
I think just being a prisoner of adult contemporary radio for a lot of years, where Eagles music never went away, it was just always the same song. I just got burnt out on it, and I just can't hear it without sort of having that PTSD moment. It's like, no, not again.
Okay, then I won't look at you with big doughy eyes and say, on a dark desert highway. Cool wind in my hair.
A song I absolutely loved when it came out. My mother used to say, this song will always remind me of you because you used to turn this up all the time when you were like, I don't know how old I was when that thing came out.
Dude, you and I'll tell you how old we were. That was the first album I bought with my own money, was Hotel California in late 76. So you and I had just turned the ripe old age of 11. And we're buying our first records. So that's how that works.
I used to turn that up all the time. Oh, that song's on. And I just turn it up and really especially the long outro with the guitar stuff. That was great. Of course.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap this up, John, why don't we talk about a little bit, or at least tell people where they can follow us on the socials?
I love it. If you would like to check out my Twitter feed, I can be found on the Twitter at JCYLCSW, all in capital letters, JCYLCSW. Tweet me.
Are you on the Facebooks?
I am on the Facebook
friends
as well.
Do you take friends outside of your friends?
Yeah, you know what? I know. The Twitter is where I interact with people who aren't friends and make enemies. Yes, you can also follow me on Facebook and Instagram as well. I think Instagram, I'm also LCSW, JCY, some combination of that on Insta. And then on Facebook, I'm just John Young. And hey, I'd love to hear from you, unless it's really, really mean. Then I delete you.
And I'm on the Twitter at Asregadoo, TASREGADOO. And I'm on Facebook too as Ted Asregadoo. And so John and I will be back soon as we dig through our crates of records to talk more about music. John, thanks so much for hanging out this afternoon, recording this on your birthday. I appreciate you taking time on your birthday to record a podcast with me.
This is super cool. A very fun way to spend my birthday. Thank you again, Ted Asregadoo. You are always awesome. I love you, buddy.
Love you too. And we love you, and thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you soon.